Aloha, everyone, and welcome to the annual TeleGeography workshop at PTC. Well, I have to say we're very sad to not be with you together in sunny Waikiki today, but you know what? We're going to bring warm aloha vibes to the best of our ability anyway. I have my Hawaiian shirt on and a lei even, and I'll tell you what, I don't care what anybody says, I'm not taking it off all day long. I'm going to stay in this moment. So I am John Yembo, and I'm joined by my colleagues Brianna Boudreau and Alan Malden. And if you've seen our workshop before, you know that we typically split this up into 3 sections, and this will be no exception. I'm going to start off by talking about what's going on in the data center and in the broader interconnection sector, particularly in light of this challenging year that we've just had. Brianna is going to share with us an overview of what's happening in the global market for wholesale network pricing. And then Alan is going to end things off with a utopian vision of the future of networks. So we don't want to miss that. Well, as you know, we try to cram a lot of wonderful, useful information into this session. I hope you'll find this thought-provoking and even encouraging. I think we have some really good news about the market to share with you. So with no further ado, I'm going to start with my portion of the presentation, and then we'll pass it off to Brianna. For my portion of the workshop, I wanted to just take a look at what's happening in the data center sector, particularly in light of what we have faced in 2020. I'm going to split this into 3 parts. First, talking about operations and how operators are responding to the unique challenges of the time. We'll then talk about pricing and look at whether or not we've seen any major changes in pricing trends as a result of the COVID epidemic. And lastly, we're going to look at how the industry continues to push forward into new markets despite everything that's going on to disrupt us. So let's start right off by looking at what's happening operationally and how operators are adapting to the disruptions of the market. A lot of the material for this section is going to come from a supplemental survey that we sent out in September, added on to a standard massive annual site survey that we do each year. We followed up with a COVID-specific survey asking operators how things have changed for them over the course of 2020 as a direct result of the pandemic. So starting with this figure on the left, we asked them how demand has changed within the data center ecosystem for colocation services as a result of the pandemic. The picture was at least fairly positive. A majority of those who responded indicated that they've actually seen an increase in demand for colocation surveys over the course of 2020. So while a lot of industries have suffered, the colocation sector and the broader networking sector have proved to be absolutely vital to the continuance of economic activity over the course of a very difficult year. So the response has been broadly positive. Before looking at that figure on the right, I want to skip ahead and look at specific verticals. We asked operators which verticals presented an increase in demand for colocation services and which ones were struggling more in terms of their demand. Overall, hyperscale and cloud were very ubiquitous as drivers of colocation growth in 2020. And that probably comes as no surprise as an increasingly diffuse workspace of isolated users has had to access services in new ways. And so we've seen a scramble for colocation and for cross connects amongst hyperscale and cloud players. But they are by no means the only drivers of growth over the course of 2020. We've also seen tremendous demand for gaming, for streaming, for government services, and along with that, educational services, and generally speaking, carrier services. So there's been a lot of activity within the data center as networking scrambles to meet the demands of a home-based working population. Now, conversely, there has been trouble in the market too, and there have been sectors that have struggled. And probably as no surprise, unfortunately, the retail sector has struggled, not just in terms of their own demand for storefront services at a difficult time, but that has then translated back to the a straining of the investments that they can put into their colocation services. So we've seen, at least in some locations, that enterprise and retail have represented a decrease in demand for co-location over the course of the year. Going back to that previous figure again and looking at the pie chart on the right, perhaps surprisingly, a majority of operators indicated to us in this COVID survey that they have not really seen delays in construction over the course of 2020. I think many of us know that there are significant exceptions to that. And that is reflected in the fact that more than a third of respondents indicated that at least some delays were experienced. At various times throughout the year, some markets saw construction and even preliminary regulatory work grind to a complete halt, in fact. Some markets moved at a slower pace, while construction crews dealt with nightly curfews. But in some locations, construction pretty much continued apace. In conversations with operators over the course of the year, we asked about supply chain disruptions in general as well. And that was also quite a mixed bag, depending on where equipment was sourced from and how much capacity was reserved on site and ready for use. Some operators were actually able to deploy new equipment and construction fairly easily, while others had to deal with temporarily closed supplier factories or decreased personnel. Skipping ahead to a slide showing some data from our annual Data Center Research Service site survey. This reinforces the fact that indeed construction has continued and new site launches have taken place even at a time like this. By our estimates, at least 40 new retail co-location sites were launched over the course of 2020 across global markets. And here you see just a sampling of those. Just highlighting a few specific operators, Equinix and Interaction alone saw 6 and 4 brand new sites launched in 2020. And that's in addition to sites that they acquired over the course of the year. So how have operators responded in terms of pricing in such a challenging time? How has the pricing dynamic changed? Well, the answer is not a whole lot. By and large, operators have chosen to maintain balance in their pricing strategies in order to provide as much predictability as possible at an uncertain time. That was reflected in our COVID pricing survey, where a vast majority of operators indicated that they weren't changing their pricing in response to the pandemic. And this bore up also in the data that we collect on a biannual regular basis in our co-location pricing survey. If we look back historically at how rates have changed, the trend line didn't change much at all in 2020. We saw no discernible COVID effect at all in the actual data that we were collecting. In fact, we've returned to a normal price difference average between European and US rates, where we typically see European rates about 20 to 30% higher than those seen in the US. And that was reflected in what we saw this past year, as it has been historically. Likewise, when it comes to cross-connect pricing, even more stability. The long-term trend here has been, there's been a long-term adjustment downward in US rates. They fell several years ago and have maintained a very even keel over the past 4 years or so. European rates in the meantime have slowly crept upwards. These trends haven't changed at all, and Asian rates have remained roughly right in between them. The only thing that's the major trend that has continued when it comes to monthly fiber cross-connect rates is that the price multiple difference between the average US and European rate has narrowed, and that's exclusively because of the slow rise in European rates. Well, over the course of 2020, in addition to being largely unfazed in continued development and demand for co-location, we saw the interconnection market continue to deploy to new places. This picture, by the way, is of an expedition from Magadan in far eastern Siberia to Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula. This is typically a 250-mile boat ride, but they took these guys in 2016 took a 2,000-mile overland route instead. So I thought that was a nice picture of what we see in our own industry as we're constantly searching for new routes to reach populations. So In my presentation last year for PTC, I noted that we've seen a concerted push by global operators of data center, IX, and cloud infrastructure into underdeveloped frontier markets. That trend has very much continued apace in 2020, despite all the challenges. And before I look at some specific examples, let's just take a quick snapshot of what we look for when it comes to a developed interconnection market. There can be a lot of factors that contribute to this, but as far as a couple of very fundamental things that we track at TeleGeography, here's a really solid list. First, we look for international capacity, specifically international internet bandwidth. If you see a lot of connected international capacity, you see a market that is reaching out to multiple other destinations for content and services, and you see a lot of networking activity ripe for development within that market. If you see a plethora of data centers, you see the infrastructure being developed in order to provide interconnection in that market. Internet exchanges, extremely critical to the cultivation of a local interconnection ecosystem. We look for a multiplicity of local internet exchange providers with numerous members and a lot of traffic. And so that's a very primary sign of health within a market. And lastly, I want to highlight cloud providers. Cloud providers can be a great indicator of immediate demand, not speculation of possible development, but immediate demand in the market. If you see cloud on-ramps, and more importantly, if you see full-blown cloud data center regions developing in the market, you see a location where international providers see so much demand that they've decided that in order to meet that demand, they have to be in that location. And so they can be an immediate impetus for development of an interconnection market. So first, a global snapshot view. This is just a quick snapshot of cloud region development among just the 3 largest cloud service providers. These 3 providers alone launched 7 full-fledged cloud regions in 2020, and they have another 26 in the pipeline for deployment now. These are spread across global markets, and most of the new ones are going to be in frontier markets. So moving into specific regions, let's take a look at what's happening. Southeast Asia is a particular challenge, and this is something that we've been talking about over the course of the year. I think we mentioned it at PTC last year, and I talked about it more in a presentation with DKIX in this past fall. We have a unique challenge here where traditionally you have one major hub for the Southeast Asian region, and that's Singapore, a very concentrated geographic area with very high co-location costs. Compounding the problem there of overdependence on that one single market is the fact that now the government has imposed a moratorium on new data center development, at least into this year, 2021, while they evaluate the effect of the data center market, the stresses that it's placing on local land and power usage. So where do you go if you want to expand your footprint in this region? Unfortunately, the nearest possible other major hub is Hong Kong, and that location has more than enough problems of its own. In addition to the local political unrest, you now have tremendous stress from the outside, as there's a probable decoupling of relationships between US and Chinese operators due to US regulatory pressure. We've seen several submarine cables pull permit requests for landing in Hong Kong, and the future of our cooperation, US cooperation with Chinese networks, is uncertain. So that's not to say that either of these hubs becomes less critical. They're both incredibly critical locations for network presence, but it raises the question of where else do you go to distribute your risk and your networking assets for the resilience. So there's a lot of talk right now about what's going on in Southeast Asia and where else could be developed. I want to highlight specifically Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta, although there are other locations we could talk about too. I want to note that in the next couple of slides where we're talking about current development, this is not highlighting all of the international interconnection assets that are in these markets. We're talking specifically about development that's happening as of right now. So either new deployments as of 2020 or developments that are currently planned for future deployment. So in Kuala Lumpur, we have now DKICs already present in that market in Malaysia, tethering peering users between Malaysia and Singapore, and they have plans for further development throughout Southeast Asia as well. You see a concerted effort by NTT to develop both of these markets, with a 5th data center being deployed in Cyberjaya and a new campus coming up in Jakarta. I think Jakarta is particularly interesting right now because we have, in addition to major cloud regions being deployed there, we have a tremendous amount of connected international internet capacity in that market at 16.5 terabits per second. No other market in all of Asia has more international internet capacity, except for the big 3 markets, the 3 largest hubs of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Tokyo. So I think Jakarta in particular is worth noting. And moving on to the Middle East up there, we highlight Qatar, with 2 major cloud regions coming into Doha, a city that has 66% compound international internet bandwidth growth in the past 4 years. That said, we've seen interconnection operators swarming across the Middle East recently, not just in Qatar, but elsewhere too, attempting to figure out where new connectivity hubs could possibly take off. To that end, we've seen data center IX and cloud operators moving into places like Cairo, Jeddah, and Muscat as well. Moving on to Europe, I wanted to especially highlight these 3 locations. Every one of these 3, Madrid, Milan, and Warsaw, are already dynamic secondary markets in their own right, but we're seeing a tremendous surge right now to further provide cloud coverage across these markets, helping to transform them into real interconnection hubs. Google and Azure are moving into all 3 of these locations. AWS and OVH are both moving into Madrid and Milan right now, and Equinix is developing a 4th facility in Milan. So if we wouldn't already classify these as full-blown interconnection hubs, I think with the addition of all of this cloud activity in the very near future, they certainly will be classified as such in very short order. I wanted to highlight just a few other markets globally. I think we've perhaps reached an inflection point in Latin America where we're moving beyond just dependence on Brazil as an interconnection hub. And really, frankly speaking, Miami being the primary one for Latin America. In my presentation for PTC last year, I predicted that we'd see some news very soon about Santiago, given its high international bandwidth growth and tremendous local peering traffic. So I'm very happy to say that we're now seeing activity as of 2020. Multiple cloud regions are now moving into Santiago, and we're seeing international data center operators doing development as of right now with EdgeConneX and Ascenty. In Australia, I think what's interesting is that we're seeing a deeper push past Sydney, with international cloud region development now happening in Melbourne as well. So that's we're seeing a push past the primary hub where international operators have already deployed into another critical market within that continent. So I'm going to close my portion of the presentation in a similar way to, as I did for PTC last year, by highlighting a few frontier markets where I think we see real promise for interconnection ecosystems to develop, but we still lack a certain level of investment by international operators. So Chennai is arguably already quite well developed, but it still lacks investment by international data center providers, particularly retail carrier neutral providers. Otherwise, you have multiple peering ecosystems, cloud footprints, and lots of connected international internet bandwidth. Hanoi is more underdeveloped at this point, but we don't see quite as much activity there. But I think when we're expecting to see a multiplicity of intermeshed nodes across Southeast Asia, we have to include Hanoi as a location where we might see some real investment activity in the near future. And that's primarily because there's a lot of international internet capacity connected there. There's a lot of networking activity, so there's opportunity for sure to develop a localized ecosystem there. Looking at a couple of other markets worldwide. Now, I mentioned every one of these markets in my prediction slides last year at PTC, but you know what? I'm going to keep harping on these markets because I like them. I think that we see some tremendous potential, and I think that we're going to see more international activity in each one of these in short order. Buenos Aires has a couple of regional carrier neutral providers and a lot of international capacity, more than 10 terabits per second. But you still see relatively small cloud footprints and a lack of diversity in the local peering market. Lagos, how long have we been talking about West Africa? With all the activity that we have seen in South Africa, there's been talk for so long about the need to really cultivate the ecosystems on the East Coast and the West Coast. We already see some movement in Kenya. We've seen recently an increase in investment by Interaction in the local provider iColo. There's rumblings of a lot of development there. But on the West in Lagos, we're seeing some incredibly promising signs as well. You see a lot of international capacity converged in Lagos. You have a couple of regional carrier neutral providers, and the peering market there has just recently really taken off and shown strong potential. There's a lot of traffic being generated in that market. So I think along with that, we will see cloud providers moving in fairly soon. And lastly, Sophia. This is another one that we could argue is already an interconnection hub in its own right. It has a richly diverse peering market, a couple of international data center providers, and a lot of bandwidth, but you still don't see any major cloud regions. So that could change in the near future. All right, before I pass this off to Brianna, just a closing thought. I think one takeaway from this very difficult year has been the fact that network and data center services have never been more critical in keeping our world interconnected. And I think it's a real credit to the industry that it has more than risen to the challenges of the times. We've seen resilience in the interconnection sector on display and its commitment to maintain operations in the face of disruptions, in the determination to maintain stable pricing in a time of uncertainty, and in the perseverance to interconnect new markets, enforcing the fact that even in relative isolation, we're in this together.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for joining us. As John mentioned, this portion of our workshop is going to be taking a deeper dive into wholesale bandwidth and IP transit pricing. And since we've all been stuck at home for a number of months now and are certainly missing being together in Honolulu, I thought it would be fun to take a virtual trip, at least, around the world to take a deeper dive into those global pricing trends. So for our itinerary today, we're first going to take the 10,000-foot view of global pricing trends. Where are we now, and how did we get here? And how did those trends compare across regions? And then doing some regional flyovers, looking at the unique factors driving pricing trends within each region. And finally, our flight path going forward. What can we expect to impact bandwidth and transit pricing trends in the year to come? So 2020 was truly an exceptional year. And while the network faced a host of new demands and challenges, the key trends that have characterized the wholesale market prior to the pandemic remain the same. Robust demand growth and bandwidth price declines continue, and this figure yields pretty familiar results. Bandwidth prices continue to decline, as they always have. Across these key routes, weighted median 100 gigabit wavelength prices decreased an average of about 15% compounded annually over the past 3 years. Now, we certainly did see a range in the pace of price erosion. For example, London, New York, that green line all the way to the bottom of this figure, prices decreased only about 7% annually over the past 3 years. In comparison, Miami, Sao Paulo, that dark blue line at the top, prices decreased about 21% annually since 2017. And while some of those lines in the middle may look a little flat, you can see I've pointed out that prices have been declining overall at a pretty steady clip on a lot of these key global routes. And as we've noted in previous presentations in recent years, 100 gigabit wavelength pricing is decreasing at a much more rapid pace than that of the more mature 10G service. This figure looks at the CAGR price decline between 2017 and 2020 for 100G service in those teal bars and 10G in the dark blue. And as you can see across most markets, 100G is outpacing 10G. Down at the bottom, Miami, Sao Paulo is our exception here. In that market, 10G still represents a strong majority of sales, and so prices are still pretty competitive and falling there. And shifting gears slightly, transit prices in general have followed transport. And that in large part is because transit pricing reflects both a market's proximity to global interconnection hubs, as well as the cost of transport to get there. So as bandwidth prices have fallen in the previous slides, transport here has followed. And we certainly have seen a range in the pace of those prices doing that. This figure highlights the CAGR price decline over the past 3 years in a number of key global markets. And the average CAGR across these cities was about 21%. Looking at the bottom of this figure, you can see in markets such as Johannesburg and Sao Paulo, where we've seen really steep cuts to the underlying cost of transport to reach global internet hubs, you're seeing the highest rates of transit pricing or price erosion as well. And despite nearly universal declines across all the routes we track, we do see a wide range in geographic price points still reported. Shifting slightly back to 10 gigabit wavelengths, not every market has made it to 100G pricing quite yet. This figure looks at the weighted median 10G wavelength and 10 gig IP transit port prices at the end of 2020. And for wavelengths, as the thickness of that line increases and gradually shifts from blue to red, your wavelength price increases. And similarly for transit, as the size of that circle increases, transit prices increase as well. And so a pretty big range here on this map. For example, Johannesburg, London, 10G waves are still about 5 times that of London, New York, certainly down from the premium we saw just a few years ago, but still a big difference. Similarly, 10G waves on Los Angeles, Sydney, still about 3 times that of the core Trans-Pacific route of Los Angeles, Tokyo. So let's take a deeper dive into what is shaping pricing and trends in some of these individual regions, starting first with the transatlantic, a region that has long been characterized by massive bandwidth deployments and the lowest prices on offer. Yet despite the maturity of this market, we still do see a pretty wide range in carrier pricing reported. This figure highlights in the blue shaded area the reported range of 100 gigabit wavelength prices on London, New York over the past 3 years. And that red line represents our weighted median price. As you can see, the weighted median towards the end of the time series does skew a little bit closer to the low than the high, suggesting that a lot of the bulk of transactions do occur on the lower end of our price range. But at the end of the 2020, we were still seeing the high price at about twice that of the low. So what factors are contributing to this range, and what determines what customers pay? Well, what you pay is often a reflection of how you buy. High volume customers, such as content providers and carriers buying in bulk, often garner the lowest prices on offer. Similarly, those opting for multi-year leases receive discounts as well. On the higher end of our range, we see our lower volume customers, and in the transatlantic market in particular, there are a number of low latency cables, and specific customer verticals such as financial services are often willing to pay a premium for a low latency service. And finally, customer segment. Those customers buying to meet internal demand often receive lower prices than those who may in turn resell capacity in the wholesale market at competitive prices. Now, these factors also contribute to the range reported in other regions, but particularly interesting to see that there's still that range in the very competitive transatlantic market. Similarly, we see IP transit prices on both sides of the Atlantic fall into a pretty tight range. Looking at the weighted median price for 100 gig IP transit ports in key hubs in both Europe and the US, you see that weighted median falls into a pretty straight line across both sides of the Atlantic, but we still do see that range in reported pricing similar to what we saw with wavelengths. The factors contributing to it here in the transit market, also volume and contract terms. Additionally, provider type. These are international internet hubs, and providers, global providers that may have established a POP outside of their home region may be a little less price competitive than regional providers. And finally, quality of service. In a very competitive transit market, a number of providers seek to distinguish themselves with a premium quality of service, which may include backbone diversity, superior jitter or latency, and that commands a premium price per meg. And it is interesting to note that a number of the providers we spoke to over the past year noted that during COVID, with all the additional demands being placed upon the network, that premium quality service was actually a selling point for customers over the past year. So continuing on and taking a look at the link between Europe and Asia, this is a market where upgrades to regional cable systems such as AE1 and CME-W5 have injected a lot of supply into an already competitive market over the past few years, and we've seen prices come down accordingly. Across all the regional routes that we track, 10 gigabit wavelength prices decreased an average of about 11%. That is compared to 19% for 100G wavelengths. And as we saw on the slide, a few previous slides, that more rapid pace of price erosion has actually compressed the price multiple between the two services, making it a lot more cost effective for customers to upgrade to higher capacities if they haven't already. This figure highlights the weighted median 100 gigabit wavelength price on key Europe to Asia routes in those navy columns, and then the red dot represents the price multiple for 100G service over 10G. As you can see across the routes, it's about 4 to 5 times the price for 10 times the capacity. And certainly, as we've seen these lower unit costs being passed along to customers in the form of lower wavelength prices, customer uptake has really increased. At the end of 2020, our global bandwidth forecast service estimates that almost 70% of lease sales are for 100 gigabit wavelengths in the region, and that's compared to just about 10% 3 years ago in 2017. So a significant shift in this market due to the price trends. And continuing on into Asia and the Pacific, markets that are always hot topics here at PTC, first looking at the Trans-Pacific route. And this is one where when we were digging into the data for this presentation, the results surprised us a little bit. Price erosion is a little bit more moderate this year across the Pacific than we have presented in years past. And there's a few factors at play here. First, looking at that Los Angeles-Tokyo route, the red line there represents 100 gigabit wavelength prices across LA-Tokyo. Across the region as a whole, we see prices decrease just about 6% compounded annually over the past 3 years, which again was a little bit more moderate than previous years. For LA-Tokyo, that rate of price erosion was a little bit higher at about 10%. We did see the launch of Jupiter this year, which may have helped inject a lot of supply and competition and increase price erosion a little bit, but it's already a highly competitive route and prices really don't have that much more room to fall. In comparison, other Trans-Pacific routes face delays and uncertainty surrounding submarine cable systems such as PLCN, Hong Kong Americas, and that may have contributed to that more moderate rate of price erosion. So really the biggest takeaway is that slower pace of price erosion is helping to sustain the premium for links between the US, Hong Kong, and Singapore over the core LA-Tokyo route. So when we do see some of these new systems come into service, they'll be injecting new diverse routes and competition into those markets, and we expect to see that price premium erode over time. Where we have seen steadier price erosion that we've anticipated are on those routes between intra-Asian hubs of Singapore, Hong Kong, and Tokyo. Across these three routes, 100 gigabit wavelength prices have decreased an average of about 19% over the past 3 years. And with a number of new regional networks planned that connect to all of these markets, we expect to see this steady price erosion decrease in the near future. But once you move outside of these international hubs, we do see prices escalate quite quickly. This figure moves back to 10 gigabit wavelength prices. Again, not every market within Asia is a 100G market quite yet. As you can see, there's a range of price points and price erosion in those red circles as you move into Southeast Asia and India. It is important to note that while these markets do retain a premium, they're also where we've seen the highest rates of price erosion, for example, in Indonesia and India. They're also markets where we've seen a number of carrier network expansion and also being discussed as alternatives to regional hubs as carriers are looking for diversity outside markets such as Singapore and Hong Kong, as John mentioned in his presentation. So high rates of price erosion, decreasing that premium across intra-Asia links. And a lot of that has trickled down to the transit market as well. Within Asia, a lot of these markets do retain a premium and because of the underlying cost of transport to access international internet hubs and exchange traffic such as Singapore. And as those wavelength prices have decreased, transit pricing in many of these markets has decreased as well. Yes, there still is a premium. At the end of 2020, Jakarta and Manila were still about 9 times the price of Singapore, but we are seeing that premium erode over time and expect it to continue to do that going forward. So continuing on down to another region, which has certainly seen a lot of investment in new networks and the impact on pricing, Oceania. New systems on both sides of Australia, connecting it to the US and Asia, and then upgrades to existing systems have certainly had an impact in pricing over the past few years. 10 gigabit wavelength prices across key regional routes decreased an average of about 29% compounded annually over the past 3 years. And looking at this figure, you can see there were some steep decreases, especially on those links to Asia at the end of 2018, early 2019, when we saw the launch of ASE and Indigo West. Similarly, on that red line that represents Los Angeles, Sydney, with Hawaii in 2018, and more recently, the launch of JGA South, which connects on to the US, you're seeing some steady price erosion on wavelengths there as well. And with the anticipation of Southern Cross next coming up, we expect to continue this trend going forward. And Oceania is really a market where that underlying cost of transport has the biggest impact on transit. Yes, we have seen interregional connectivity increase substantially, particularly as a number of new carriers have established IP POPs and cloud service providers are expanding their presence down to Oceania. But a majority of the region's traffic is still global, transiting to the US or Asia to exchange traffic. And the cost of that transport has kept prices at a premium historically. This is a regional snapshot kind of our earlier global map that highlights the wavelength pricing between Sydney and Singapore and Los Angeles in those red lines, and then IP transit pricing in those circles. And the biggest takeaway here really is that the cost of that transport across the Pacific is a primary factor in determining transit pricing in Australia and the premium that it incurs as a result. Now, as we remember from the previous slide, a lot of that is changing. Transport prices have fallen dramatically and transit prices have followed. In Sydney, 10 gigi IP transit port prices have decreased about 23% compounded annually since 2017. And further reductions in transport pricing, coupled with that increase in intra-regional connectivity that we're seeing, should continue to reduce the premium between transit in Australia and other global network hubs. So taking a big jump for our next stop, we're going to go all the way to Latin America next. And this is a region that is still feeling the effects of a number of new cable systems and upgrades, and in combination has seen the expansion of global and regional carrier network footprints across the region, and wavelength prices have fallen accordingly. Across key regional routes here, 10 gigabit wavelength prices decreased about 24% compounded annually. We do see a range of price points in the market still though. For example, all the way at the bottom of this figure, you'll see markets such as Brazil and Mexico are among the most competitive pricing that we see. On the other end of the spectrum, with that dark blue line, you see connections to Bogota remain about twice the price, despite seeing some of the highest rates of price erosion over the past few years. And similar to Oceania, this is a market where those underlying costs of transport and the cuts to it have had significant impact on transit pricing. Historically, most carriers have purchased transport en route to Miami to exchange traffic, and that has been the primary driver of transit pricing. And while no single venue has emerged as the most cost-effective and practical venue for traffic exchange within Latin America, you are seeing markets such as Brazil more local traffic exchange for a number of regions. Generation of local content, an increase in caches bringing content from the US, as well as the narrowing of the gap in price difference between local transit and that pipe and port model of going all the way to Miami. This figure here is highlighting to the left of each year the cost of transport to Miami in the dark blue and the cost of transit in Miami in the red versus what it costs to purchase transport locally in Sao Paulo. As you can see in 2017, there was a substantial price difference, making it a lot more cost effective to purchase that onward transport to Miami, but that difference has narrowed over time. Now the pipe and port model isn't going anywhere. There will always be a need to access a lot of content in the US for Latin America as a region, but as that difference decreases and you see more local venues for traffic exchange, both business models will tend to be more popular options. And finally, our last stop on our trip around the world is Africa, where cable upgrades and new market entrants have actually driven the steepest price declines we've seen over the past few years. And it certainly does range between coastal hubs as well as South Africa, but across the board, 10 gigabit wavelength prices have decreased an average of about 31% annually over the past 3 years. We've observed the most aggressive price cuts in markets to the West Coast, largely a result of upgrades to the wax cable system, which injected a lot of new supply in that market. On the other end of the spectrum, more moderate price erosion and the lowest prices already in Johannesburg, which serves as a regional hub. And another unique factor that is impacting pricing in Africa is that Africa only became a more robust market for 10G service recently. And so prices are pretty high and have a lot more room to fall. And so that also contributes to these higher rates of price erosion compared to other markets that we've covered today. And finally, Africa is also our last pipe and port market, and those cuts to transport have had a significant impact on transit pricing in the region. Yes, Johannesburg, transit pricing in Johannesburg is still about 10 times that of London, but that's down from a staggering 23 times in 2017. And a large part of that is the cut in the cost of transport to reach London to exchange traffic and access content. And again, this map is highlighting the impact of that wavelength pricing on transit in different regional hubs in Africa. The lines represent the wavelength prices and the circles for transit. As you can see, Johannesburg, which has become a regional hub for traffic exchange and does have some local venues for traffic exchange and content hosting, boasts the lowest prices, followed by the East Coast hub of Kenya and Lagos on the West Coast. So, I'm tired. We've covered a lot of ground here today. So just a few thoughts to wrap it up and take an outlook for what we can expect to impact bandwidth and transit pricing in the year ahead. As I mentioned, much of the global market has migrated to 100 gigabit transactions or is in the process of doing so. And the lower unit costs associated with these higher capacity services have driven down wavelength prices for customers as well. With 200, 400, and 800G line rates coming down the road, we can expect lower unit costs for those services to continue this trend of driving down prices in the future. In addition, new direct routes in regions, integrated backhaul on some of these new systems, and technological improvements, such as high fiber count cables, will also offer cost improvements over existing options, and those lower costs will be passed along to customers in the form of lower wavelength prices. For the IP transit market, lower unit costs, those transport price cuts that we saw in so many of the markets we covered today, and intense competition continue to fuel further price erosion for transit services. And finally, despite declines in recent market convergence, we don't expect to see a unified global price going forward due to some of the regional differences we discussed today, differences in global network topology, underlying costs, and demand volumes. And each of these factors continue to impact regions in different ways and at different times. So it is important to occasionally take those regional deep dives and keep our eyes on the trends going forward. Thank you.
All right, I'm here to present a closing presentation for today's workshop. So my topic today is going to be the utopian future of international networks. That might seem kind of strange, given what's happening in the world today, and the news each day is ever more crazy, but let's get started here. So first, why utopia? So I actually gave a talk at PTC 5 years ago that was focused on the dystopian future of international networks. So this year I wanted to do actually the opposite kind of. I think we need to have a little bit more of a positive view right now in this time in the world. So let's look at, first of all, what is a utopia? So a utopia is a imagined place or state of things in which everything is perfect and good and lovely and nice, right? So it's the opposite of a dystopia. So what I'm hoping to do in this presentation is go through a series of traits that are commonly associated with a utopia and try to tie a trend of international networks to that trait. So let's see how this goes. So the first trait I wanted to talk about is a concept brings society together. So the concept I wanted to talk about here is compound growth and the role of bandwidth demand. So Einstein supposedly said that compound interest is the most powerful force in the universe. But I think what we're seeing right now in this industry is the compound growth of bandwidth demand is really proving to be the most powerful force that we're seeing. So just how fast is demand growing or has been growing? Let's have a look at some data from the past decade. So looking at the last decade at the compound annual growth rate here for some various international regional routes, you can see there is pretty strong growth, right? That's no surprise. But in terms of the compounding effect, I find it really good to think about it in terms of doubling. How fast is the total demand doubling on these various routes? So let's look at some different lines or some cutoffs to see what we can see. Doubling every 3 years, that would imply a 26% compound annual growth rate. All the routes here are well above that, right? So we're growing really fast. Let's go even faster. Let's go to doubling every 2 years. Again, all the routes are still above that threshold. And some are even really even faster than that. Let's go to every 18 months. You can see here that a few routes are even in excess of that at that point. Here we have Europe to South Asia and Europe to Sub-Saharan Africa are two routes that we have seen growing at a rate that's exceeded doubling every 18 months over the last decade. This is really rapid growth. The next trait I wanted to talk about is society becoming more equitable. Yes, a utopian dream. For this, I wanted to look at prices. So Brianna touched on this a bit earlier in her talk, but here we're looking at prices for 100 gigabit wavelengths for 7 major routes around the world and how they've been trending over the last 5 years. Prices are always going down. That's really no big surprise. But what I want to look at is, are they becoming more equitable, more similar? Is this difference narrowing? So to do this, let's look at the lowest price here, which is the London to New York route as a baseline, and compare the prices to that baseline route. So we can see here when we compare the dark blue, which is 2016, to the aqua, which is 2020 for these routes, there has been a substantial reduction in the variance between these prices and the London to New York route. So for example, on the far right here, the LA Sydney route, it used to be 12 times more expensive than London to New York, and now it's less than 7. So some big differences happening in the past 5 years alone. So this is the utopian dream, right? Price equality. Is it ever going to happen? Well, I think prices could continue to narrow some more. The main factor here, I think, is that we're seeing more rapid growth in the markets, in many markets that currently have higher prices. And as those prices, as the demand grows more rapidly on those routes, it could lead to lower unit costs relative to some of the more developed and larger routes. Next, we're going to see some more competition. We're seeing more cables being built, but isn't it just new cables? It's new participants. It's new companies who are getting involved in the market and competing to sell capacity. And finally, it's technology. It's being able to have more express routes and landings of cables directly in data centers. It all helps to reduce equipment costs. And again, lower costs is passed through in terms of lower prices to customers on most routes. But as Brianna mentioned earlier as well, prices will never be the same across all routes. It's not going to happen. There's just too many variations in the unit costs due to the differences in the demand volumes and the distances. So while prices are indeed narrowing, they won't be constant or flat across markets anytime soon. The next trait, let's look at Utopian trait 3, economic system that doesn't favor a certain group. So for this trait, I wanted to look at what's happening with the investment in new submarine cables around the world. So if we look at the investment of cables based on the year they are entering service from 2014 to 2022, some planned cables here, I've grouped them roughly according to the type of investment, whether it's content provider money, the traditional carriers, or carriers, others, and kind of different types of companies. So interestingly, from last year and this year, next year, there's roughly a similar amount of investment coming from all three of these type of companies. It may seem a bit surprising, but we all know that the big content providers are investing heavily, Google and Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, but the carriers still have a big role too. We see Telstra, NTT, Orange, other companies who are traditional carriers still involved heavily in this industry. And finally, the carriers, whether it's Aquacoms, RTI, Hawaii, Ella Link, there's plenty of companies who don't fit some of these other groups who are still investing in new systems. So we're seeing, kind of a shifting landscape in terms of what's happening with cable investment. Content providers, as I showed in the previous slide, they don't dominate overall in the total, dollar amount for just looking at new system investment, but they do on some routes. The Atlantic especially is heavily dominated right now by content provider investment. Also, content providers, it's important to note, they're needed to really fund some of these builds. Maybe they don't account for the majority of the investment, but them just acquiring, let's say, a quarter or a third of the investment on a cable is really important to make that cable become going from a dream to an actual cable in the water. Also, content providers, they probably do dominate if we consider the investment in new cables, plus the SLTE sales, plus the purchases of all the bandwidth that they're buying, outside of this. They definitely are the largest player, in the market. The final point I wanted to make on this issue is with the coming increases in the fiber pair counts in SDM cables, we could see new types of companies investing in submarine cables because of the lower cost per pair. When you have a cable that's a 16 or possibly a 32 pair cable, the cost per pair is becoming more and more affordable. So we could see new types of companies from the outset of cable investment. Building a cable opt to take a share and invest in a cable. So that's the utopian dream, right? A pair for everybody. Let's go to the next trait. Individuality and innovation are welcome. See here a lot of different kinds of houses, trees going through the house, houses on the trees, whatever you want, lots of options here. So for this, I wanted to look at route diversity. So we're seeing a lot of new cables, and many of them are offering some pretty novel and unique routing options. So the two I've shown here, the planned L-Link cable should be in service in the first half of this year, kind of a unique route from Brazil to Portugal. On the right, the Oman to Australia cable, the first cable from the Middle East directly to the west coast of Australia. Also, other new diverse options they have for AC2 cable from the US to Denmark and Norway. We'll have a branch to Ireland in the future as well. And also here, the CAP1 cable, a direct US to Philippines cable, kind of avoiding the more traditional routes between Japan and the US. So some unique, diverse routing options there. But it isn't just about having diverse routes, it's about having diverse landing points too. So looking here, we can see the JGA South cable, which entered service last year. This features the first landing point. You can see there just north of Sydney. So the first landing outside of the greater Sydney area. On the right, I've shown the to Africa cable and Egypt. Now you might say, diversity, Egypt, this is crazy. But there are some traits about this cable that are kind of unique. They are planning to have 4 different landings in Egypt. So there is some planning to have new diversity where the cables land to help to enhance and create more resiliency for the trans-Egypt traffic. Okay, moving right along here to this one, which is technology solves problems of resource exhaustion. So let's look here at how technology has played a role in helping to solve problems with the supply of bandwidth. So the past 2 decades of this century, we've seen just a massive amount of capacity growth. This is showing the capacity of cables, the maximum capacity in the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's increased 472-fold in the Atlantic and 357-fold over the last 20 years. It's mind-boggling. It's a massive amount of capacity. So how did this happen? How are we able to do this? Let's look here at what we've seen in terms of the capacity on a per cable basis. Well, roughly the capacity of cables have increased from, in 2000, you'd have a cable that was about 4 pairs, maybe 640 gigabits per pair, to now, last year, a cable could have maybe 12 pairs at 20 terabits roughly per fiber pair. We're already seeing planned cables with 16 fiber pairs and cables with even more being planned as well. So the ability for the technology to advance and to ramp up the capacity per cable has really enabled this to happen. So if we look at this in kind of a different way, let's look at what this took on a per cable basis to reach those levels I showed in the previous slide. It took us less than 1 cable per year. So 15 cables in the Atlantic, but in the span, and 12 cables across the Pacific. Now that's pretty impressive. We had that, I said, 400 plus fold increase in the Atlantic, 300 plus fold increase in the Pacific, all through just a relatively modest number of new cables, but it was the ability for each subsequent cable to have more and more capacity being able to be carried across it. But let's consider, what if this never happened? What if we did not see an increase? What if we were stuck with a 4-pair cable that could only carry 640 gigabits per fiber pair? Well, we would need a lot more cables. How many more? A lot. Let's adjust the y-axis here to get this to fit on the screen. Okay, we would have needed 332 cables in the Atlantic and just 201 in the Pacific to have the same amount of capacity. This is obviously crazy, but the point here is to demonstrate just how important the advances in technology have been in the past to get where we are today. It's not just the number of spans. This would have been extremely expensive. If we assume that a cable in Atlantic would cost, let's say $200 million, Pacific would cost $300 million, what would it have cost us to do this? Well, it would have been a little bit expensive, like, from 7 billion to $66 trillion worth of new cables. I mean, clearly this is not, was just a fantasy. It would never have happened, but this is just another way to think about how important it is to have the capacity of per cable always going up over time. Which leaves us looking at now the future. That this was the past 20 years. We had the ability to ramp up the capacity of cables. So going forward, what are we going to need? Well, we need a lot more cables for sure, and more advances for sure in the technology. Here I've mapped out these 2 major routes with 3 different scenarios for growth, from a 40% growth, 30 and 20, with the red lines depicting the capacity of the existing and the publicly disclosed planned cable. So you can see here, when we get to the middle part of this decade, we're going to need some more cables on both of these routes. Now, how many we need is going to depend on a lot of things. How fast is demand growth going to be, but also how much can we push down a single cable? So if it's going to be a 16-pair cable, that implies, a lot more than if we need to have a 32 pair cable or beyond. But even if we get to these later years, you can see that we're looking at, you know, a petabit or 2 petabits sometimes being needed per year. So if we have a petabit cable, which would be a very aggressive, you know, type of cable to build in, let's say, the next 5 years, we could need to have 1 or 2 of those per year on these routes to have enough capacity. Now, it's really hard to know how this is going to shake out, but I think we all accept that we'll need more cables, but also have to spend a lot more money than we have in the past for new cables. We're not going to be able to have, you know, just 15 cables in the Atlantic for the next 20 years like we had in the previous 20 years. It's going to require more investment in new cables, it looks like. So finally, Utopian trait 6, society continues to evolve as new challenges arise. So here's some depictions of different utopias over time. The bottom right is, I think it's called the concrete utopia from the former Yugoslavia. So it's kind of a very strange thing. I hope we don't have to experience that type of utopia ever. But we've all been evolving throughout the past year, given the challenges of COVID. We've evolved to have things like this, like a 43-person video call. But let's look beyond that. Let's go to what the future is going to hold for us. Can we reach a utopian heaven of some kind? Let's see. Well, first of all, we need to be cautious here. A utopia, as I mentioned in the very first slide of this, it's an imagined place. So there are still challenges ahead. A few of them, first of all, as I mentioned previously, we need to have a lot of investment across the industry, whether it's in R&D, new cables, training, education, to really cope with the compounding effect of demand growth. Also, John mentioned this in his presentation as well. There are substantial geopolitical and regulatory challenges that continue to exist around the world. I'm sure there'll be many different panels and talks during PTC about these topics. Definitely worth everybody to check those out and listen to those. And finally, the digital divide still exists, and there's more efforts needed to improve network access, as well as the reliability and the resiliency of networks really around the world. So while I think the future for telecom is very bright and is utopian in many ways, there's still some work to be done here. So with that, I want to conclude TeleGeography's annual PTC workshop. I want to thank John and Brianna for their presentations. Here's our emails. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us directly. We're happy to provide some answers if we can, or some comments about today's workshop. And I truly hope that next year we will be seeing you all in Honolulu for a real proper PTC workshop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, TeleGeography. At this time, we'd like you to head over to the submarine cable poster sessions in the Subcable Networking Lounge to view the remarkable work from industry representatives. And join us back in the Tapa Auditorium at 9:30 a.m. Hawaii time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern time for an amazing opening reception sponsored by Paradigm. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Get your dancing hips ready and get ready to win.